This is a review of the chess psychology book, The 7 Deadly Chess Sins by Jonathan Rosen, who is a GM from Scotland. Now, this is a follow-up to episode 16, where I reviewed Chess for Tigers by Simon Webb. However, if you didn't listen to that episode, you can do so at another time because this will work as a standalone episode. All right. Now, 7 Deadly Chess Sins is more of an advanced book. It's kind of a follow-up to Chess for Tigers. So I'm going to kind of go back and forth between both a little bit. Now, let me just say up front, I highly recommend this book, The 7 Deadly Chess Sins. All right. This isn't going to be like some YouTube video where you have to wait till the end to give my opinion. I absolutely recommend it. I've used it myself. I refer to it all the time. I will not recommend something unless I have experience with it personally. So this book has my highest recommendation. There is a link for that and Chess for Tigers in the show notes, so you can check those out. And this episode is going to be all about the psychological and mental aspect of the game. Many players never improve for this very reason, despite their theoretical knowledge. They think it's all about, well, I need to improve my knowledge of pawn structures, or I need to study the endgame more, or I need to study the opening more, things like that. And they'll do that. They'll build their theoretical knowledge, but their results never seem to get better. And it can come from errors in the psychological aspect of the game. Now, let me give you an example. I know an expert. He was about 2000. He might have bounced back and forth in, between the high 1900s and low 2000s, but that's a very high rating. And he used to come to the club, and we were talking one night about Looseness or Lucina. Is it Lucina or Lucena? I don't know. I should know. But anyway, Looseness and Philidor's positions, those are rook and pawn endings where one side is trying to queen a pawn. I won't get into those now, but they're very well known and quote unquote essential theoretical rook and pawn endings. And somehow those came up in our conversation at the club. A few of us were talking, and this expert player never heard of them. All right. So they say, oh, you got to know those. You got to know Lucinas and Philidors. Yet he never heard of them, but his rating was 2000 or so. The reason is he was so strong psychologically and as far as the thought process and the mental aspect of the game that the theory just didn't matter, because he had this skill and this determination to just find the best move and just to kind of go deeper beyond, what was in the board in front of him, to really analyze and look deeper into the position, even if maybe he didn't have some theoretical knowledge. And then you have other people where they have a good theoretical knowledge of the game, but their rating is plateauing just because they make mental errors at the board. All right. Another example is the bishop and knight mate. Now that's sort of a controversial thing among chess players and coaches. Do you teach students to do the mate with bishop and knight? It's a very tricky mate. One argument is that you should, because it, improves the thought process and your pattern recognition and your coordination of the pieces. And then the other argument, which I tend to agree with, which is that it's kind of a waste of time, because you could go your entire chess career and never even have the opportunity for a bishop and knight mate. It's kind of like getting a royal flush in poker. Like if you play poker, you may never even get that hand, that type of thing. So that's something to think about there. And then we also have the Pareto principle, which I think applies to chess and the psychological aspect of the game. Now, for those of you who don't know, the Pareto principle is the idea that 80% of your outcomes or your consequences come from only 20% of your causes. So a simple example would be in retail. The Pareto principle would state that 80% of your profits come from only 20% of your products. I think that's true for chess improvement as well, where 80% of your losses, let's say, are from only 20% of your chess knowledge. In other words, you have your theory, your opening theory, middle game, end game, tactics, all that stuff. And the psychological aspect is one of those, obviously, but I think that's the 20%. so to speak, that's causing 80% of your losses in some cases. All right. Especially if you have a little bit of experience and you're beyond the point where you're like dropping pieces and, dropping pawns, things of that nature. And I need to make that distinction. If you're just starting out, because I know we do have a lot of beginners who listen to this podcast, which is great. When you're first starting out, your focus needs to be on avoiding gross mistakes, dropping pieces, dropping pawns, missing basic tactical shots, missing mates in one, things like that, working on your basic tactics, forks, pins, skewers, removal of the defender, overloaded piece, all those things, all the basic mates. That needs to be your focus. But once you get to a point where you're not dropping material that easily and you're not making those gross mistakes, you do need to start thinking about the mental aspect of the game. And I will say this, regardless of where you're at, whether you're a beginner or whether you're rated 2000, it's my firm contention that as far as chess psychology, these two books, these two resources, Chess for Tigers and the focus of this episode, The 7 Deadly Chess Sins, those are really the only two books you ever need because they're that good and they're that thorough. I mean, you could argue even Chess for Tigers might be enough, but once you achieve a certain amount of skill, you do need to look at The 7 Deadly Chess Sins. All right, but again, these two books are really all you ever need. You'll be set. It's not like you have to have 10 books on your shelf for chess psychology. If you have these two, Chess for Tigers, 7 Deadly Chess Sins, you are set because they're that good. And we're going to talk about them today a little bit. Again, there are links below for both of those. And know that for this episode, I will be going through each of the 7 sins he mentions in the book as part of the review for amateurs, okay? I'm going to speak about this book and its principles as far as the club level and amateur players. So what I mean by that, if a bunch of grandmasters were sitting around discussing this book, the conversation and its application would be completely different. All right, so I'm going to go through these sins as an amateur player so that you can relate them, and bring that knowledge to your actual games. All right, because I think it's a different approach at the amateur level. So I'm going to keep that in mind. Now, I know many of you are busy, as I am. That's probably why you're listening to this podcast, because there is a sort of bias or emphasis towards adults and adult improvers who have full-time jobs and families and who have limited study time, but yet are serious about improving. And the reason I mention it, The 7 Deadly Chess Sins is a little bit of a dense book, and there's a lot of explanatory prose, but there's also a lot of games for each chapter. And the point is, you don't need to necessarily go through every single game in the book. I think if you read the explanatory prose and really understand it, which is excellent, and then maybe go through 1 or 2 games per chapter, I think you'll be set. I know when I keep referring back to this book, I'm looking more at the words and the prose than I am the games, because his explanations are excellent and you can get an idea of the themes and what he's talking about and then apply them to your own games. I'm going to be referring to a chart that he has on page 12, all right, where he lists each sin, the common symptoms, and then the main antidote. It's sort of like a summary chart for the whole book. So I'm going to use that as kind of my platform to talk about all 7 sins. And again, we're going to be discussing this as it applies to the amateur level. 3 of these sins out of the 7, I feel are the most important at the amateur level and the ones that give the most people problems, not just based on my own games and, my own, issues that I might have with the psychological aspect of the game, but just in speaking with other people and observing and in running a chess club where it's all amateur games, I clearly see that these 3 sins apply to most players. So when we get to those, I'll point that out. Now, the first sin he lists is thinking. Obviously, he's talking about erroneous thinking. Some of the common symptoms of this erroneous thinking are confusion, pattern limitations, and lack of faith in intuition. And as a matter of fact, he lists intuition as the main antidote. And that's what the first chapter is all about. Now, essentially, his main thing is that sometimes the rules, the quote unquote rules, need to be broken based on the specific position at hand. For example, on page 55, he says, thinking tends to be based on rules and justification, which leads to confusion, given that chess is largely rule dependent and often inexplicable. All right. So I think the main thing is sometimes you have to go against sort of the typical book rules to find the best move. And if you don't look at it that way, that can stifle your thinking. For example, let me give you a couple of examples. We've all read that you should be very careful about moving the pawns in front of your castled king. And some books will even say, don't move your pawns in front of your castled king. But guess what? Depending on the position, moving a pawn or more than one pawn in front of your castled king may be correct or even necessary. Or in some cases, it could be a tactical move that wins the game. All right, so that's one example. Another one, this is one of my favorites, right? Don't move the same piece twice in the opening. You may have heard that, right? Don't move the same piece twice in the opening. Don't do anything until you moved each piece at least once. That's kind of weird. I mean, to say that, because there are times where it's correct to move a piece more than once in the opening because it's all position dependent. But if you're so firm in the quote unquote rules and the quote unquote theory, you might miss opportunities. So that's one of the things he discusses. So this is all about thinking and confusion and erroneous thinking patterns. The second sin is blinking. And he lists the common symptoms of blinking to be missing key moments, lack of trend sensitivity, and moment sensitivity. And he lists the antidote as sensitivity. And what he means by that is you really need to be aware of the changes that occur in the game as far as moving from one section of the game to the next. In other words, you have to be sensitive to key moments in the game. So for example, there could be an exchange sequence that changes things drastically, or you could be transitioning, let's say, from the middle game to the end game, or from the opening to the middle game, or your opponent makes a move that completely changes things. And if you blink, you can miss it. That's why he calls it blinking. So it's all about being sensitive to these different changes in the game. He lists it he has a summary, I should say, in the conclusion. I think that wraps it up very well. He goes, blinking occurs when we miss key moments or critical positions which lead to a change in the direction of the game. So if that game changes direction, but you're not aware of it, right, then you blinked. All right, and that's the second sin. Now, the third sin is one of the most important. I mentioned that there were three sins that I felt were the most important and the most common at the amateur level. This is one of them, and it's the sin of wanting, which is really when you're just concerned about the result. You just want the win, and that's all you're thinking about. And his cure, or his antidote as he calls it, is having gumption. And he defines gumption as enthusiasm, composure, and practicality, which is really about just focusing on the contest, enjoying the contest, worrying about good moves, and not just thinking about the end result. And I'm going to give a few quotes because he states it very well. This chapter on wanting is probably worth the price of the book alone. All right, and he says this is from page 92. When you feel gumption for a task, game of chess, you identify with the task at hand and somehow feel untroubled by any resistance you may experience, knowing that that is part of the process, right? So you can sometimes, be annoyed. Your opponent, he's driving you crazy. He's just trying so hard to get the win also, but you have to expect that. You have to expect a struggle. All right. It's like Roger LaFleur said when I interviewed him, you always have to expect a battle. You can't expect your opponent to roll over. and you can't get frustrated when he puts up resistance. All right. So here's another quote from the book. Similarly, you have little chance of feeling gumptious if all you care about is gaining a particular result, because then you're liable to resent the fact that you have to sit down at the board for however many hours. Then rather than identify yourself with the chess struggle, you'll think only about the position with reference to the result you are seeking, and thus won't feel any identification with the position at all. It will seem alien to you. Furthermore, lack of gumption may be one of the symptoms of looseness, which we'll consider in Chapter 7. All right, so I gave you a little spoiler for one of the other ones coming up, but you get the idea. You're so concerned about the result that you're not focused on the position in front of you. And he discusses something in this chapter that he calls plus equals mode. He talks about Jonathan Spielman, GM, who advocates for this. And this is what plus equals mode is, okay? It's basically where you play the entire game just for a slight advantage, where the entire time you're slightly better than your opponent. But when you do that, it can often drive the opponent crazy and it makes him very unsettled, and he can eventually make a blunder. All right. So in other words, the best way to get a big advantage is to play for a small advantage, right? He says that on page 93. But let me give you his passage about plus equals mode, where you try to push for a slight advantage. Now, the reason it's called plus equals mode is because, as most of you know, on a chess engine, it'll say plus equals if white is slightly better, or equals plus if black is slightly better, excuse me. But here's what he said. So the key insight to my defeat, he lost this game to Spielman, is what Spielman calls plus equals mode. Despite what I said about the danger of such symbolism in the previous chapter, if properly understood, the idea of playing only for a slight advantage for a prolonged period can be very awkward for the opponent at the other side, especially if he wants only to draw and not to play. The player in plus equals mode seeks only to maintain a healthy position and very gradually to improve it. Such a strategy is only possible when the position is rather simple, but this is often the case when your opponent is trying to force a draw. Transformations of the tiny advantage are an integral part of the strategy, but the emphasis is on keeping psychological pressure on the opponent, even if your position is only minutely better. So the idea is that, you're slightly better the whole time, and that's causing kind of a psychological pressure on your opponent, and then he can eventually crack. So I'm going to read this last paragraph. The best way to get a big advantage is to play for a small advantage. The advantage is largely psychological, persistent, and can lead to the type of disorientation that we saw in Miles' Arkell above. That's a game that he went through. All right, so he's basically saying you play for a small advantage rather than try and force things, and that puts a lot of psychological pressure on the opponent. But the larger point is, with wanting, if you're so focused on the result and you just want to win, you're not going to feel gumption or enthusiasm for the position in the game itself, and you need to enjoy the contest, and then the win will come. The fourth sin is materialism, and this chapter is pretty straightforward. He does give a lot of examples, but the sin of materialism is basically where you're thinking about point count and how much material one player has versus other aspects of the position, So in other words, just because one player is up quote unquote material or is up point count, that doesn't necessarily mean he is the better position. You have to look at the big picture, because very often the player who's down on point count can have compensation. So this is the summary from the end of the chapter, because I think he wraps it up really well. He says materialism is a multifaceted sin. It is based on the fact that there is a conceptual flaw in the ways in which we assign values to material. It limits our imagination because material factors are so entrenched and inflexible in our thoughts that we often cannot see good moves which involve giving it up. Material values may hold, in general, quote unquote, But chess is exceptional, and we play exceptional positions one game at a time. We tend to suffer from angst when material down and instinctively associate material loss with error. I suggest 3 main ways to try to overcome this predicament. 1, try thinking of all the pieces as unique characters rather than just a certain number of points. 2, think of the pieces as bundles of energy to be judged on their ability in a given position rather than blocks of wood with a static value that never changes. See chess as a game of 4 dimensions, only one of which is material. And he talks about those dimensions in the chapter. An example of where point count, may not be significant would be, for example, if you give up the exchange. All right, you might give up your rook for a knight, but then his pawn structure is ruined and you have an attack on his king. All right, or you might give a rook up for a bishop and it's the same thing. Maybe your knight is now better than his rook, whatever it might be. So you can't look strictly at point count. And he goes through this in the chapter about materialism versus the overall position. Now, sin number 5 is big. It's egoism. All right. And we all know that chess is a big battle of the ego. And with egoism, you're more concerned about your own ideas. You fail to be objective. You fail to think of your opponent's ideas as carefully as your own. And as a result, that causes mistakes. And what I like about this chapter, I won't give any quotes because I don't want this whole thing to be a litany of quotes. I've kind of did a lot of that already, maybe a few more at the end. But in the chapter on egoism, he talks about responsibility and prophylaxis as the main antidotes. So for responsibility, it's more about what the position calls for rather than simply what you want to do. And he talks about prophylaxis, preventing the opponent's ideas. All right. Roger LaFleur referred to this as me chess, where you just do what you want to do and you don't think of your opponent's ideas. But that's what happens with egoism. You may have an idea or an attack that you want to start, but your opponent sees it and he's preventing it, but then you push ahead with it anyway, and then it's wrong, and then you end up losing the game. All right. So with egoism, you have to be aware of your opponent's ideas, prevent them as best you can, and not just think of your own ideas. Now, one of the things in this chapter that I love that he says is that egoism often manifests itself in the refusal to make concessions to your opponent, even when they are necessary. So you may not want to give up, let's say, the bishop pair, but the position may require you to do so. All right. And that stubbornness can often lead to problems, and that's part of egoism. You may not want to make a certain trade, but it's the correct thing to do in the position. Again, responsibility and prophylaxis. But this issue of ego and just thinking of your own ideas and not your opponent's, that is rampant at the amateur level, which is why egoism is one of the big 3 that I mentioned. You see it all the time. Now, sin number 6 is the third most important sin. All right, I mentioned that 3 out of the 7 were the most important. The first was wanting, the second was egoism, and the third is this one, which is perfectionism. That is huge. That is a major problem. I know for me, that's probably my biggest sin as far as the psychological aspect of the game. And this comes from a lot of what we're taught in the books, right? If you find a move, sit on your hands until you find a better one. What wonderful thing does this move do for my position? If you can't answer that, don't play it. And all these different things. And you want to look at candidate moves and this and that. But the problem is with perfectionism, when you're so focused on finding the absolute best move and nothing else, right? I'm not going to play it unless it's the absolute best move. That's going to cause all sorts of problems. It's going to cause time trouble, and it's going to cause you to maybe try to mimic a move you saw in a book, but it doesn't apply to that position that you have in front of you. And he says the main antidote for perfectionism is confidence. Now, I will say Chess for Tigers also talks about perfectionism as well. All right. So there is a little bit of overlap between the two books, Chess for Tigers and the Seven Deadly Chess Sins. But perfectionism is such a big sin that it's worth discussing at length. Now, the idea with perfectionism is you want to look for adequate moves, not necessarily the best move, because if you try to always be perfect, like I said, you're going to get into time trouble, and then that's just going to cause more issues. All right. And you can, use your clock in much better ways. Like, for example, a common thing with perfectionism is the witch rook scenario. I think I mentioned this in episode 16. For example, you need to contest the E file because your opponent put his rook on it. So do I go, rook F to E1 or rook A to E1? And you'll waste 6, 7, 8 minutes on your clock obsessing over that, trying to make the perfect move when most of the time it really doesn't matter. Okay, the only time moving, the right rook might be an issue is if you move one of them and, it causes a blunder or a tactical thing. But many times there's no tactics on the board and you can move either rook, but you'll obsess over it. All right, or it could be a recapturing of a piece you can take back with the knight or the bishop. Of course, you need to evaluate that, absolutely. But many times you're going to have a position where it really doesn't matter, but you'll waste time on your clock obsessing over it. So it's really about playing adequate moves and not perfect moves and having confidence in your position. An example of perfectionism would have been in the last episode where I talked about that pawn I could grab. I was talking about hot pawns, like should you take it or not? And rather than obsess, I decided to castle instead. I mean, I thought about it, but I didn't take a ridiculous amount of time. But if I had been a perfectionist about it, like the sin of perfectionism, I would have obsessed over that capture for a long time, wasted time on my clock. And, that could cause me time trouble later on. And even in Chess for Tigers, he talks about how even a player as strong as Anand was known for making adequate moves rather than perfect moves. Okay, because if you're always looking for the absolute best move, you're going to drive yourself crazy. You're going to wear yourself out mentally when you're going to need that energy for trickier positions. But the most important thing is that it's going to get you into time trouble. With these quicker time controls, especially at the club level, like you're doing a game 90, you're doing a game 60, you're doing a game 75, perfectionism is going to cause you problems. You can't be taking 6 minutes a move. Like take my club, for example, like game 90, even with the 5-second delay, you can't take like 5-6 minutes on every move, or at least on 3 moves in a row. You're going to get into too much time pressure. You're going to have problems. You need to be able to make decisions, be confident, and don't worry that it's not the objectively best move. See, the worst thing you can do, in my opinion, and he talks about this in the book a little bit, you don't want to make a move that's adequate, that's perfectly fine, and then like you're obsessing, oh, I should have done this, or this might have been better. You're going to drive yourself crazy. But he talks about this at length, the idea of perfectionism. And you have to understand that at the club level, the games are going to be a little scrappy. They're going to be a little junky. They're not going to be clean because you're playing at night. It's after work and, there's other things going on. And with the time control that it is, it's going to be a little bit ugly. There's going to be mistakes. And when you review the game after even, you can't, beat yourself up over every little thing. With a game 90 time control, let's say, or even a game 60, game 75, whatever it might be, if you're playing at night at the club, which is going to be the scenario for most people, the games are not going to be perfect. You just have to expect that. And so if you're obsessing all the time on playing the absolutely best, objectively, perfect move, you're going to run into problems and you're going to get into time trouble every time. Now understand it's a balance, okay? Because you don't want to go too far on either end. What I mean by that is you don't want to go so far on perfectionism that you're obsessing and losing time. But on the other hand, you do need to take your time and do a blunder check. Absolutely. Okay. So perfectionism doesn't mean just move, the first thing that pops into your head. No, you do need to check it. Of course, exchange sequences, as I've mentioned, are very important. You have to check your positional ideas tactically. Let's say you want to make a move to control the dark squares, for example, you have to say, okay, but if I make this move, am I going to drop a piece, or can he do something tactically? You do need to take the time to check your ideas, absolutely, but you can't do it to the point that you're wasting time on your clock. And it is a tough balance. This is a lot easier said than done. But with perfectionism, you get so obsessive about your moves that you're losing time on your clock, like I said. And then once you're in time pressure, forget it. In fact, he even says, going back to the first book, Chess for Tigers, that if time pressure is a recurring issue for you, if you're constantly finding yourself in time pressure, you need to clean up that aspect of your game before anything else. All right. We could talk about openings and endings and all this theoretical stuff, but if you're constantly in time pressure and then blundering, you need to clean that up first. And perfectionism could be one of those reasons. But the chapter in the book, I won't give any quotes from it, but he talks about this at length. And in my opinion, it's one of the most important sins. As I said, for me, and I think for many players, perfectionism is the number one sin as far as the psychological aspect of the game. All right, so the last sin is looseness, which I mentioned briefly before. It's similar to blinking. Looseness really refers to just losing the plot or the flow of the game. He lists the obvious antidote as concentration, which of course makes sense. I mean, obviously we need to concentrate more, but he explains it in more detail in the book. So with looseness, like I said, we're sort of losing the thread or the path of the game, and we're missing out on important transitions and adjustments that need to be made. In my opinion, blinking and looseness are kind of the same thing. I mean, they're slightly different, but they're also kind of similar. So I don't know, that could almost be the same thing. Just my take. But this is what he says about looseness. He says, we have to make an extra special effort to move from one phase of the game to another mentally and emotionally. So for example, we have to say, okay, it's the end game now. Things have changed. I don't need to worry about being mated anymore. It's important to look at this position with fresh eyes. You'll know best how to do it for yourself. But since transitions are such a big part of chess, it is hugely important that you are emotionally ready to play the position at hand rather than playing the new position with old, inappropriate emotions. So in other words, when you move to the end game, for example, you have to sort of mentally go with that. Because remember, the end game, it's about king position. You want to activate your king. It's different responsibilities. Obviously, in the middle game, you want to protect your king. Now, the one thing he says here, though, you just have to be careful. All right, he goes where he says, it's the end game now. I don't have to worry about being mated anymore. That's not really true. You always have to worry about being mated. I think he just means that if you're in an end game and like a lot of, the queen and a lot of the heavy pieces are off the board, it's, a middle game attack it's not as worrisome and not as likely. All right, if it's like a king and pawn and rook endgame, but he's wrong about that. I know the context that he meant it in. In other words, he meant you're not in the middle game anymore. You need to think of the end game, but you always have to worry about being mated. I can't tell you how many games I've seen or I've played myself where even a strong player would miss like a very basic mate or a very basic back rank tactic idea. All right. So you always have to worry about being mated anymore. So I kind of disagree with how he wrote that because that can kind of be taken the wrong way. Doesn't matter if it's the opening, the middle game, the end game, or, however many pieces are or are not on the board. You always have to be aware of mating threats. Okay. And if you start to relax, oh, it's the end game, I don't have to worry about being mated. That's not true. You need to be careful or your opponent could create a passed pawn that could lose the game. But the idea of looseness, what he's getting at is being aware of the different transitions and different moments in the game and knowing when the game has taken a turn to something else. Because you'll see a position and you have a certain mindset. Okay, he's playing on the king side, I'm playing on the queen side. and, I'm controlling this square, he's controlling that square, that type of thing. You're aware of the ideas, but then boom, something happens. He makes a move or you make a move, and there's an exchange sequence, and all of a sudden the plans now have changed. But he's saying with looseness, you're kind of still thinking about the old position. All right. So those types of transitions and being aware of those, very important. But again, I think looseness and blinking are kind of similar. So to wrap this up, of the 7 sins, thinking, blinking, wanting, materialism, egoism, perfectionism, and looseness, I feel, this is my opinion, that wanting, egoism, and perfectionism, sins 3, 5, and 6, those are the most important and most common at the amateur level. You could maybe argue thinking as well, but I think wanting, egoism, and perfectionism are the biggies. All right. And just to kind of put a bow on this, Chess for Tigers by Simon Webb and The 7 Deadly Chess Sins by Jonathan Rosen are highly recommended by me. I do feel, as far as the psychological aspect of the game, they're all you'll ever need as far as resources. They're that good. I highly recommend them. I have a lot of, experience with them myself. I refer to them all the time. They're outstanding. Everybody I recommend these to, thanks me. And there are links below. If you want to check them out, it's all there. But this was all about chess psychology. It can really prevent you from getting better if studying chess theory is not doing it for you. So if you're learning all the quote unquote essential theory, but you're finding yourself losing a lot of games, this could be why. All right. Which is why there are many players where they're lacking in some theoretical knowledge, but they do very well because they're so strong with the psychological aspect of it. And, just like there are players who are excellent theoretically, but because they're having such issues psychologically, they're not getting any better. The players who are the strongest have sort of both lanes working, on overdrive. They have an excellent theoretical background and they're very good with the psychological aspect of the game. So it's a lot to think about. It's a lot to take in. Again, the 7 Deadly Chess Sins, it is an advanced book. I don't like to necessarily put numbers on these things, but if you're rated below 1400, I would definitely start with Chess for Tigers. Although you can read the 7 Deadly Chess Sins, you'll get a lot out of it. But once you get over to, over 1400, once you're a Class C player, I think you should add the 7 Deadly Chess Sins. But both books, regardless of rating, are readable. But I just think that if you're, sort of starting out, if you're maybe rated 1,000 or if you're a beginner, you have other things to worry about. You have to worry about your basic tactics and dropping pieces and all that. But you can definitely look at Chess for Tigers. And then as you get better, as you're getting away from that beginner phase and you're becoming more of an intermediate player, your tactics are better. You're not dropping pieces anymore. You're not making silly mistakes anymore, at least on a regular basis. Players of all levels, including GMs, make blunders once in a while. But once you're not blundering all the time and your game is a lot cleaner, then look into the 7 Deadly Chess Sins. All right. But between both of these books, you should be set, for quite some time as far as the psychological aspect of the game. So I hope this helps. Very thorough discussion, very important discussion. Thank you for listening. And as always, I hope you win your next game. Have a great day.